Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video where I provide the juicy nuggets to give you a greater contextual understanding and a wider informational landscape concerning the Ukraine War. It's the 13th of November, but hopefully this might have a slightly more maybe evergreen notion to it, this video, because I'm going to be talking about fascism and how it pertains to Russia. Trigger warning, I might annoy some of my listeners because I will be talking a little bit about American politics and also Hungarian politics and looking at the parallels there. But it's always worth questioning our own beliefs, right? If someone comes along and criticizes something about us, our identity or our country or whatever, rather than have that knee-jerk response of being defensive and attacking the person who's just said that, just take a little pause to go, does any of that hold water? Does any of it have merit? Is there a slight truth to that? Like, if a number of different people are saying this, could there be something to that? Just take a breather before attacking me, and then attack me. And I've got thick skin. I'll take it. Anyway, before we get to that point, talking about fascism, let's go into a few of these nuggets. I haven't given enough props to the Netherlands, to Holland, and people from Holland. Not that they individually had much say in the matter, but here we have a column of Dutch armored personnel carriers, YPR 765s in Kherson. So here you go, Holland, this is for you. Whoop whoop, Dutch APCs, and a bunch of them, quite a few of them, trundling off into the middle distance. Thank you, Holland, on behalf of Ukraine. I'm sure they appreciate them. There've been quite a few of those seen in use since they were donated, so that's cool. So this is interesting. Consequences. After reneging on its previous Black Sea agreements, Moscow now complains it's lost world markets for its food exports. Hey, good old sanctions. Commerce, Russian commerce, is effectively blocked because Western sanctions have cut Russian shippers access to finance, insurance, and ports. So people like Lloyd's insurers, but London-based insurers, pretty much dictate or control or almost monopolize the world's maritime insurance market. And if you can't get insurance, it becomes a little bit of a problem sailing your ships because it's highly risky. And if Russia's ships are unable to be insured because of sanctions, then hey, you've got problems. You have to self-insure, and that you need a lot of capital to do that. All sorts. So a bit of a problem for Russia going forward, and they're finding life a little bit difficult. I guess that's what happens when you invade another country and you suffer the consequences. Okay, this is worth having a little read. Another great Chris O thread. Only 4 out of 91 mobilized Russians. So this is an anecdotal story, I guess, but I think it's fairly reflective. Only 4 out of 91 mobilized Russians lasted a week under HIMARS and shell fire on the front line in eastern Ukraine. They were told by their colonel that their equipment is worth its weight in gold and we will recruit new ones instead of you. So let's look at the story. The independent Russian news outlet Astra reports that the men were sent to recapture the village of Nevsky, about 30 kilometers southwest of Svatova. This happened on the 25th of October, 2 days after the Ukrainians took it, with heavy reported Russian casualties. Astra reports, quote, the mobilized men of the 35th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade from Aleisk, Altai Krai, who were drafted in late September, have been sent to the front line after 2 weeks of, quote, useless training. On the 25th of October, they were sent to attack the village of Nevsky, having been given 7 infantry fighting vehicles, of which only 2 started up on their own. The rest had to be pushed. On the very first day, 2 of the 3 platoons were ambushed and suffered casualties. One of the mobilized men told Astra. The next day, they, quote, came across a more prepared ambush where we were greeted by both equipment and more professional military men. Close quote. The commander told them that, quote, they shouldn't be there here on the front line and gave the order to retreat. As the president said, the mobilized will either be in the rear zone or on the 4th line of defense. We found videos on the internet with Putin's words about this, says a mobilized man. About 60 conscripts out of 91 from our interlocutor's company retreated to Svatova. The rest stayed at the front line. There in Svatova, they say they were met by the deputy commander of the Central Military District, who gave them 2 houses to sleep in and said he would, quote, deal with them. And I've covered a couple of stories in the Svatova area, and this might be the crossover with one of those stories, but fleshing out a little bit more. After that, for 8 days, different ranks from majors to generals came to the people who refused to return to the front line and intimidated them by saying that, quote, we have only one choice, to go to the front line because there is no time to send you to the prosecutor's office, end quote. From one of the military commanders, the mobilized heard, quote, no man, no problems. That is, if we die, it will be easier for them. The colonel tells us, our equipment is worth its weight in gold, and instead of you, we will recruit new ones. Now the mobilized are in the rear in Luhansk Oblast and are demanding that a meeting with the military prosecutor be arranged for them. Quote, they do not send the military prosecutor's office to us. They just intimidate us. They promise to give us a medical examination and training and send us back because we will be supposedly ready. Salaries are also calculated differently from how they should be. I only get a third of my salary. Some have loans which they promised to freeze, and they also did not provide credit holidays, says the Astra interlocutor. The mobilized are also afraid to talk about it openly because, quote, yesterday guys from our battalion recorded a video message, and today the military police arrived, handcuffed them in front of everyone, and took them away. Those from the company that remained at the front, about 25 people, stayed there in the trenches for a week, keeping their heads down. Their commander was killed by mortar fire. They did not know what to do and also decided to retreat. After that, in the nearest settlement where they reached the remnants of the company along with other soldiers, they came under HIMARS fire. According to the mobilized man, 4 people survived from the company. And this is just reflective of the terrible situation these mobilized troops are being thrown into very often when they are given virtually no training, very poor equipment, and then thrown up against people with decent training and decent equipment and heavy bombardments. It must be a pretty torrid time for them. And speaking of mobilized troops, here are a bunch of them getting pretty irate. So reports coming in of a near riot among newly mobilized soldiers at the well-known Park Patriot west of Moscow in Russia. The forcibly conscripted know they're heading to the front line and angrily complained at lack of training. The general himself tried to reduce tensions. Check out the subtitles at the bottom.
А чё нихуя не радует? Как не радует? Вот это что это, блядь, такое происходит? Элемент чего, блядь? Да нахуй мне нужен? Мы на войне строим будем ходить, блядь. Нет, а хули вы тогда это делаете? Да, серьезно? Хорошо, давай. Какого хера мы пишем, блядь, бумажки того, чего нам не хватает, блядь? И для этого мы потом собираем тут толпу, устраиваем хуй пойми что, это профанация, блядь. Имитация стрельб, имитация учений, имитация строевого строя. Я? Мало. По 15 патронов нахуй приходи стрелять. Зарядив ему 2 рожка, изобразив, блядь, воображаемого противника на танковом полигоне, воображаемому противнику, блядь, тра-та-та-та-та. А доходи... Сколько раз? 2 раза на пристрелке и 1 раз на учебно-контрольных стрельбах. 1 раз мы... Помолчи, блядь. 1 раз мы были на полигоне для стрелков. Все остальное время мы на танковом полигоне занимаемся дрочью, блядь. Какое там слаживание? Вас самих привезти, посмотреть, может, внимательно. Со мной побегаете, послаживаете? Ну давайте, пойдем прямо сейчас побегаем, послаживаемся. Я вам покажу, как. Давайте я буду говорить, пацаны, я начал, я закончу. Базар идет пока только со стороны Минобороны. Как никакого базара? Я еще раз говорю, почему мы стреляем по воображаемой пехоте противника? Где мишени, которые поднимаются, выдвигаются? Почему мы проводим тренировки по стрельбам на танковом полигоне? Что значит у нас определено? Я вам сейчас ваше место определю. Запросто. Я думаю, даже, и оно более достойно будет, чем в данный момент.
Okay, and so some of these subtitles were pretty poorly translated there, but you get the idea. And I showed you a video recently about, say, there were 50 odd conscripts that didn't have any guns, and they were being sent out on a training mission against their sort of enemy, who all had, you know, assault rifles or whatever. And they're like, what are we supposed to do? Stand and pew pew at them? Like, what, you know, it's just the complete lack of quality training. These guys are saying, what are we doing? Training shooting on a tank range. You know, where are the you know, popping up people that we're supposed to shoot? Where's the you know, there's an imaginary enemy, and it's all just complete nonsense and just really really poor quality training. Now for him to be that angry and show that anger and contempt for his officers and generals is absolutely outrageous. But obviously it's got to such a point. It's like, what have I got to lose? And I guess it's like, well, if I get put in a military prison, I've got, you know, I prefer to be in a military prison maybe back here around Moscow than being sent to the front line where, you know, there's large chances I'll be killed. So, you know, I find that pretty interesting stuff. Okay, moving on to a completely different point. Over to the general events of today. 2 H-125 Airbus multi-purpose helicopters in Ukrainian camouflage were spotted in Poland. This is part of the contract with the French. So this is interesting. French contracts to get a couple of these helicopters. And, you know, interesting. I wonder what kind of role those helicopters will play. But it's good to see this kind of variety of kit being sent to Ukraine. That's obviously the French responsible for that. And let's go on to this next one. Okay, so I'm going to go. No, actually, I'm going to do that last. That was in the wrong place, and then I've got everything in the wrong place. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about fascism, and I'm going to give you over to Dr. Ian Garner here on the Ukraine the Latest podcast. He's got a book coming out next year about Russian neo-fascism, and he has so much good stuff to say, which completely dovetails with my previous claims about fascism and my reading of other books. For example, the great How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them by Jason Stanley. Really good book. And he looks at how fascism has kind of risen again in Europe. You look at Viktor Orban, you look at other elements of European society. And then actually a lot of his talk was you can actually map a lot of these things onto Trump and the rise of this kind of fascistic thinking. You guys might go, oh my God, he's not mentioning Trump again. He's not an anti-Trump screed. No, but when you look at some of the things Trump was doing to do with trying to regulate free press and calling them the enemy, make America great again, which is actually a fascistic slogan from the Second World War. Really interesting. The America First program in the Second World War. Very interesting. And these bucolic ideas, well, I'll go through the whole list of them, and you can work out for yourself whether these were elements that were used particularly in 2016 around that time. But anyway, that's kind of by the by. It's not really the core point of what I'm trying to say here, but that's a very good book and really easy, quick read as well. Very good. So what is fascism? Well, fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of the opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation and race, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. And my claim is that you can see some of that in some of the desires of some players on the American right, as actually you can do. You know, Bolsonaro in Brazil is a great example of a dictatorial fascistic regime in all but name, really, and other places around the world. You know, it is fairly commonplace as we start forgetting the Second World War, as those generations pass away. Our collective memories of fascism dissipate, and the problem reemerges. But here it is as it pertains to Russia.
So we know that in the 90s there were Russian fascist, neo-Nazi and neo-fascist groups knocking around, and of course Zhirinovsky is the famous political proponent of a sort of neo-fascism in the early 1990s. And there's always been this debate in Russia over westernizing versus going the Russian route. So becoming more attached to Europe or becoming more insular, more Russian, and Russia having a great power status. And Putin essentially came into power promising that all the traumas, all the embarrassments and the humiliations of the 1990s were over, that Russia would now be strong. And he literally used this word in his first speech as president on New Year's Eve 1999, that we would be living in a fairy tale world. And of course, fairy tales are distinct from reality. And so we often hear about this term of managed democracy, the idea that the Putin state has created a kind of pretend electoral system with pretend parties. But what we also see is that it's created this kind of stage-managed culture in which it's constantly inflating and putting on performances that demonstrate Russia's military might, and at the same time encourage ordinary people to participate in what are increasingly militarized rituals in day-to-day life. And of course, the big one that everybody sees every year is 9th of May, Victory Day, when everybody goes out, dresses up, and talks about the Russian sacrifices. And of course, they tend to neglect the other nationalities involved in those sacrifices in World War II, when many, many people died in order to supposedly save the world. And here we go back to Russian Messianism. That's really where we link to today. The idea that war, that sacrifice is somehow going to rebirth the nation. That's the thing that's suddenly going to push us over the edge into the realization of this glorious mythical world, and we'll all be living in this fairy tale utopia.
Do you get a sense from...
Right, and I will now just flip you over to Jason Stanley's book, because that's a nice introduction there, and you can talk about even Putin using that term fairy tale, and Garner there talked about this idea of mythicism. So this is from the introduction of Jason Stanley's book, and I'll read just this section to you. The most telling symptom of fascist politics is division. It aims to separate the population into an us and them. Many kinds of political movements involve such a division. For example, communist politics weaponizes class divisions. Giving a description of fascist politics involves describing the very specific way that fascist politics distinguishes us from them, appealing to ethnic, religious, or racial distinctions, and using this division to shape ideology and ultimately policy. Every mechanism of fascist politics works to create or solidify this distinction. And aside from me, you remember when I played you, for those who've watched most all of my videos, the Russian commentators on national TV talking, and in fact they got sacked after that because it went viral. But they were talking about like how Ukrainians aren't human beings, and they this complete dehumanization of Ukrainians and the us and them of Ukraine and Russia. And they were talking about burning Ukrainian children and drowning Ukrainian children. It's all really terrible. But this is absolute us and them politics. So, and this is the key part. This is all these bold terms are part of the 10 pillars of fascism that Jason Stanley talks about, with how you get to a fascist society. So the end result, like Nazi Germany as a classic example, was arrived at through a very sort of deliberate installation of these construction of these 10 pillars of fascism, so and what it's built on. So fascist politicians justify their ideas by breaking down a common sense of history in creating a mythic past. We've already heard about that from Garner, so it's super important. Again, I don't want to have a go at America, but it is just such a really interesting parallel. Make America great again. It's this idea of like, what it used to be great. When was it great? The 1950s, when you had segregation? Like, it wasn't great for black people. The 1890s. No, when was America? When was this great period? And of course, it's a myth. And it's the same. It's happening in Britain as well. It's the idea of the British Empire and Brexit and all this. Like, we want to move back to this great period. It's like, yeah, but what was great about that? Our massive exploitation of other nations to our own ends. Yeah, great for us, maybe not great for them as other human beings. So on and so forth. It's the us and them, but it's this mythology. It's this mythic past. It's super important. to support their vision for the present. They rewrite the population's shared understanding of reality by twisting the language of ideals through propaganda and promoting anti-intellectualism, attacking universities and educational systems, the old liberal institutions, as it is, or as they claim it is, that might challenge their ideas. So it's not just about attacking them for being libtards and liberal institutions, but these are the institutions that might intellectually challenge the foundations upon which your fascism is being set. And so therefore, anyone that challenges us needs to be got rid of. So we can ridicule liberal institutions. And this is exactly what Viktor Orban's done. He's got rid of what's his name's university in George Soros's university in Hungary, and he's literally not just ridiculed it; he's got rid of it. It's been dismantled, so on and so forth. And you're taking down your opponents and the ability for your opponents to exist. Eventually, with these techniques, fascist politics creates a state of unreality in which conspiracy theories and fake news replace reasoned debate. As the common understanding of reality crumbles, fascist politics. So this is, and again, sorry to go back to America, but this is the whole fake news. If you just throw fake news at anything, even if it is real, there's something in psychology called the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is, and it's how advertising works, is the more you say something, the more credible it becomes. And in fact, they've done loads of tests on this with regard to Facebook and how fake stuff spreads 5 times quicker than truth. So, which is really, really problematic, and it's why social media needs to be regulated quite carefully, which is a real worrying thing about, Elon Musk. You've got to add all these things together, right? If you've got someone coming along and saying, right, I'm going to get rid of moderation, then what does that say about truth? And of course, you're allowing a state of unreality to take place. We know that truth spreads 5 times, falsity spreads 5 times quicker than truth. And the more you say something, the more credible it becomes. So if you've got someone saying fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news all the time, then a lot of people are going to think that, well, that's fake because of mere exposure effect. If you're exposed to something, the more credible it becomes. That's Coke. Oh, I'm going to buy some Coca-Cola because I've seen adverts of it, subliminal, whatever. The more it is said, the more you're exposed to it, the more credible it becomes. As the common understanding of reality crumbles, fascist politics makes room for dangerous and false beliefs to take root. First, fascist ideology seeks to naturalize group difference, thereby giving the appearance of natural scientific support for a hierarchy of human worth. In the Second World War, Jews were seen as rats. They were dehumanized. And literally not the same species as we are. And as soon as you do that, it gives you permission to do all sorts of other horrible things. When social rankings and divisions solidify, fear fills in for understanding between groups. Any progress for a minority group stokes feelings of victimhood among the dominant population. So you see again, I don't want to pick on America, but the kind of victimhood of dominant groups in America. So Christians are a really dominant group in America, and they often talk about how they're being persecuted themselves. So actually, they are the dominant group, and it's this reversal of persecution and victimhood. And it's the same with you see this in all similar sort of places. In Viktor Orban's Hungary, he has really used something called Christian nationalism as a really powerful tool to say, oh, it's the immigrants we are victims of the immigrants. They're going to come in, the Islamic immigrants, and they're going to take over, blah, blah, blah. And it builds up this sense of victimhood, even though you are the dominant group in the area, utterly, completely. And then it goes on to law and order politics has mass appeal, casting us as lawful citizens and them, by contrast, as lawless criminals whose behavior poses an existential threat to the manhood of the nation. So Trump did this with Mexicans, and Viktor Orban's done this with immigrants in Hungary and from outside of Hungary. And UK during Brexit did this an awful lot with immigrants. They were painted as being criminals by loads of newspapers, Daily Mail, Daily Express. I had an argument with my father who talked about all this. He came, he was like, he's a huge Brexiteer, and he gave me a load of stuff he got from Daily Mail, and I basically unpicked every single bit of that factually, but of course it's water off the duck's back, because this is playing to his intuitions and playing to his what he felt, his psyche. And so, rationality often doesn't come close. And actually, when you looked at the stats for immigrants at the time in the UK in 2016, that they had a lower criminal across all those demographics, a lower criminality than indigenous British populations. So, statistically, it didn't work. But of course, fake news, right? You don't need, as long as you're saying something enough, people will believe it. And if you're playing on fear, and again, it goes back to this, the fear that has been mentioned already, then it's you're up against it if you're trying to win on facts, right? And then this last one is really interesting. Sexual anxiety is also typical of fascist politics, as the patriarchal hierarchy is threatened by growing gender equity. So the idea that women have greater rights and the getting into politics and having equal rights and all that, but then it's the whole thing about gender and sexuality and all these things. They're a big threat to this kind of wanting to conserve the essences of humanity as the more fascistic thinker would think, as according to this model and similar ones, as like Ian Garner would be saying. As a fear of them grows, we come to represent everything virtuous. We live in the rural heartland, so this is really important. Bucolic heartland plays into all. So really interestingly, aside from fascism, just if you look at conservative versus liberal politics the world over, so look at America and look at the map of look at the midterms. Look at the midterm map that's just come out. It's virtually all red, but land doesn't vote. So when you take out the geography of it and look at population wise, the red disappears and the blue of the Democrats is all around the cities. And the same with the UK, except the colours are reversed. So the UK, like England particularly, is almost entirely blue. And you think, wow, it's completely conservative. Well, actually, all the Labour heartlands are these very geographically small but very densely populated urban sort of multicultural liberal heartlands. And so there is this idea that plays hugely into fascism, which is this idea. So if you talk about conservatism, taking it to the extreme, it's the nature of the bucolic great past, playing on all of these sort of threads. So the rural heartland, where the pure values and traditions of the nation still miraculously exist despite the threat of cosmopolitanism and the nation's cities, alongside the hordes of minorities who live there, emboldened by liberal tolerance. We are hardworking and have earned our pride of place by struggle and merit. So Arbeit macht frei is a German, over the concentration camps, like work makes you free. It's exactly that, struggle and merit, and they are lazy, surviving off the goods we produce by exploiting the generosity of our welfare systems. This is so common, or employing corrupt institutions such as labour unions meant to separate honest, hardworking citizens from their pay. We are makers, they are takers. You see this all the time, and this still maintains in like the midterms just now, in the UK elections, in the Brexit election. Is like they're going to come over here and they're going to sponge off our welfare. Again, huge myth. When you look at the actual stats, ONS stats, all the stats you want to look at, the immigrants are generally male, working age males. So therefore they're working, they're not pulling on the welfare systems from pensions, from needing healthcare because they're younger and they're fitter, and they're generally coming over to work, economic migrants. So they're net contributors. On balance, they are higher net contributors than the indigenous population. So again, it's complete false claims that these people might be saying, but it's part of this idea that we are the makers and they are the takers. It's the us and them separation. And there are issues with immigration, of course there are. No, this is all very nuanced, but I'm trying to paint the idea of what fascism, what the pillars of fascism are, and how we can see that in all the countries around the world. Every country has these issues. Yes, I'm picking on the US and the UK, but that's because I'm British and have a lot of experience of writing about American politics, and also a lot of the viewers will be of those two nations. Obviously, you guys are all from everywhere, really. So maybe I'm talking rubbish. Many people are not familiar with the ideological structure of fascism, that each mechanism of fascist politics tends to build on others. They do not recognize the interconnectedness of the political slogans they are asked to repeat. I have written this book in the hope of providing citizens with the critical tools to recognize the difference between legitimate tactics in liberal democratic politics on the one hand and invidious tactics in fascist politics on the other. And I think that is super interesting and on point. And this is what Dr. Garner is also talking about. Now, I have written about this in other places. And basically, these are one of the pieces I kind of summed up what you're saying there, which is a great mythic past, fascist propaganda where everything is inverted, the news is fake news, anti-corruption is corruption, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order being victim of the outgroup, sexual anxiety, the real values come from the bucolic heartlands, not the urban degeneracy, and the outgroup is lazy, work will make you free. So bear all those in mind, and we will return to Ian Garner for a little bit more. So let's return to him, talk about whether how Putin, uses this myth-making sort of ideology.
I think he's always been a nationalist. He's always believed that Russia should be a great power. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Lots of people would disagree with me, but I would say that today he is a real believer in the ideology. And when you listen to him speak, he's perfectly fluent, perfectly conversant in this language of myth. And of course, some people would say, well, it's all just a pretense. And I would say to those, well, it may be. But if all he ever does, if all he ever says is in the language of this sort of fascist mythology, as he is doing right now, and has been doing really for the last 10 years or so, ever since he came back to the presidency, then what other conclusion can we possibly make? And really the important thing at this point then is to think, what's the effect on ordinary people? And I'm sure we'll get into this. When this is the language that they hear, the language that they speak, the language that they are taught in schools, it almost doesn't matter what reality is, because that's the reality they create for themselves, especially on social media.
And this idea of social media is hugely important for how these ideas disseminate. Garner goes on to talk about how intimately related the Russian government, or Putin and his regime, is with the Russian Orthodox Church. They're almost as one at the moment. They're using each other to great effect. And that kind of version of Orthodox Christian nationalism is hugely useful for Putin to utilize. So now he'll concentrate a little bit on what people actually believe.
What is interesting here is that, of course, when you look at opinion polls are roughly split. 20% of people are radically for the war, 20% of people absolutely opposed. Everybody else is kind of swimming around in the middle, swayed a little one way, a little the other, or claim that they don't care, they're not interested. But I'm really interested in the way that the state has been using social media to create worlds for people and create groups, permit groups and encourage groups where the language of war, the language of fascism is spread. So we see, everybody's seen these symbols, the Z symbols, the memes of kids dressed up going to war, the stuff that's extremely offensive and racist and often homophobic, targeted Russia's enemies, which need to be destroyed somehow to create the future. And this stuff just builds up in the environment. And especially over the last 10 years, the government has cut down, deliberately restricted alternative points of view. So that increasingly what we see is the only way that you can be any kind of a Russian, whether you would proclaim yourself to be a radical nationalist or not, is to agree that LGBT communities should not exist, that Ukraine should not or cannot exist or somehow needs to be subjugated to Russia. It's a process of elimination. And the government, of course, feeds this material in through bots, through troll farms, but there are a great many people who believe it and who share it. And of course, if you follow Russian social media, if you have Russians in your social media feeds, if you visit VK or Telegram groups, this stuff, this material just constantly flashes past you.
This is where you need to think about the mere exposure effect and how incredibly important that is.
Flashes in front of your eyes because your friends like it, your brothers like it, somebody that you went to school with shares a piece of, Ukrainian phobic meme or some video, a lie, a provocation or something like that. It creates an environment in which the only way you know to speak about the world, the only certainty you have is this language. Everything else is under attack.
You mentioned the impact of all of.
I think that's absolutely, it appears to me absolutely spot on. That social media environment where the Russian people are flooded, and also just the television media environment where you've shut down all the other alternative viewpoints, means that you are being fed only one thing. And now we're hearing that there's going to be sort of military training in schools. So you're starting to build up a brainwashing of Russian citizens from the beginning onwards. And what is now being taught in schools as well is really strongly in line with this nationalist fascistic agenda. Is really worrying. So Garner's book is about the effect on the or how the youth are being sort of targeted, and this is something he has to say on it.
So when I was looking into this book, as I mentioned at the beginning here, I was really curious about this very young generation, the generation that's in school now. And I think it's fair to say that this process of depluralization, this process of restricting the meaning of what it can be to be Russia, to be Russian, has been extremely effective over the last few years. And Putin and the regime are putting a lot of money into youth groups, successfully growing paramilitary groups that kids can join, whether voluntarily or having been voluntold at school or in the community or by a parent, by the parent's employer, where they are learning that Russia is the greatest country in the world. Russia does have this messianic role, and that the greatest thing that they can do as a Russian, as a human being, is to sacrifice themselves for the nation. And of course, there is this inherent contradiction in fascism, the obsession with the future, the obsession with creating utopia, but the idea that the youngest generation always has to sacrifice themselves is there. But young people are increasingly engaging in this militaristic language, in this violent world. They're learning military skills. And I believe today one of the Russian politicians, I don't recall who it was, declared that as of next year, every Russian child will have to take military training in schools. This is a world in which war is becoming a normal way of life. The schools are becoming increasingly patriotic, increasingly about military sacrifice, increasingly homophobic. It is becoming hard to be anything but the ideal Russian. All young children are seeing are these images, these vision of what it means to be a good Russian. And these things are appealing. There is a sense of belonging here that they're not offered if they want to, for example, grow interested in LGBT communities that they might look out for in the West.
Can you explain for us a little bit? I mean, you mentioned, we all know, we're familiar with the Z symbol in the Russian invasion. Are there any other symbols we should be aware of? And if so, what are they and what do they mean?
So, I mean, there is a whole world of symbols out there. It's almost impossible to answer the question because there are so many. And there is a deliberate rationale behind this, in that fascism is a great consumer, a voracious consumer of symbol and meaning. It will crunch up material from the Soviet era, from the Tsarist era. It will create new symbols, as we've seen with Z and its little brother V. And it will throw all of these into this great mythical time frame and claim that these are all evidence of Russia's greatness in the present. And so when you see in particular the Soviet symbols, they're not really alluding to the idea that we're literally going to recreate the Soviet Union. They're this point of bonding whereby sharing a Soviet flag on your social media profile, what you're doing is you're saying, I believe in this vision of Russia as this great place of harmony where everybody can be together. And of course, then your friends can like and share and click and say, I believe too. And it almost creates this sense of kind of a non-stop fascist rally. You don't need to wait for the government to organize that rally on social media because it's constantly going on. Every time you post your clip of somebody waving a Russian flag, somebody waving an old Soviet flag, an old Tsarist flag, or any of the new symbols, in a sense, they're each individually meaningless, but taken together, they create these pools where people belong. Outside of those pools, you're on your own. You're Western, you're liberal, you're queer, you're bad, you're broken, you're traumatized, you're just as fragmented as the 1990s were. But when you belong to these images, when you take part in them, well, suddenly you belong to something much better.
Just a last...
Absolutely fascinating, and I think we all do that. I mean, that's a form of virtue signaling. We all do it. We all change our avatars to or whatever to represent certain thing that's happened recently, or post things on Facebook. The way that we dress, the way that we do our hair, or whatever, is a sense of like giving an indication of who we are to the outside world, and we're kind of implying that I'm like this, we should all be like this type thing. And I remember having a guy that used to attack me all the time on my blog for years, and he was a dyed in the wool conservative, but he used to attack me for being a libtard and all that kind of stuff, and he would attack people for virtue signaling. But at the end of each and every comment, and he made thousands of comments, he would write the word Semper Fi, which is the Marines' kind of slogan. And I picked him up on this so many times. Say, you do realise, and you're attacking people for virtue signaling, but you are signaling your own virtue by saying I'm a Marine, and therefore this makes me some kind of a good person, or somehow this is you're proud to tell people that, which is fine, but don't attack other people for virtue signaling if this is what you're doing, which is virtue signaling. And I thought it was a really interesting contradiction, but people are contradictory, of course. Anyway, there you go. So what he goes on to talk about, Dr. Ian Garner, is the problem with the children, and unpicking that, because they are being brainwashed. So unpicking that is a generational thing, and that's really difficult. And one of the, I really suggest you go and listen to the whole talk. But one of the things he said we should utilize in the West is cyber and the information landscape, the information sphere, if you like. So hit them back with cyber warfare in terms of presenting an alternate view, because if the alternate view of reality is being shut down, if all you're getting is a TV media diet of state media that is very much curated by the regime, then you are not getting any kind of idea that an alternative exists. And so you need to present that back to them, but be careful in the way you do that. And he talked about an example of Arnold Schwarzenegger at the beginning of the conflict, giving a very powerful video message to the Russians, but he kind of got it wrong halfway through. He said the first half was absolutely really powerful, and talking about how he had met a Russian bodybuilder and they did this and X, Y, and Z, and it's all kind of getting into their mindset, and I'm one of you, blah, blah, blah. And then he went and attacked Russia and Putin's regime halfway through, and it kind of undid all of that work, which is to say you need to present an alternate reality and a positive view of what the world is. But if you start attacking those people you're appealing to, or their regime, or part of their identity, then you will invoke something in psychology. It's called the backfire effect, which is to say that these people will entrench in their original position even more vehemently. So I will have annoyed loads of people who are watching now, and they probably turned off already. But if you're still watching, and I've annoyed you because I've attacked some part of your identity, some part of your political identity, then there's more chance that I will have made you entrench in your original position and want to attack me personally more than actually dealing with what I've said and saying, okay, that's interesting, I completely disagree with that, and he's kind of attacked me in my position, but let's take that on board and see whether he's right or wrong. That doesn't happen. People don't think like that in the main. Some people do. Awesome. But in the main, people will entrench and become even more vehemently of their original position. So it's counterproductive to do that, and then attack the person, attack the messenger, and that's just part of the psychology of humanity, the backfire effect. So that's really something to watch out for. But this is to say that, you know, if Russia's using bots and cyber warfare to attack us and you know, unseat our democratic principles, then hey, we can use those tactics back at them and think about the way that we can do that for a really powerful effect. You know, it's a lot cheaper than you know, providing untold amounts of NATO equipment. So on and so forth. So it's really, honestly, go and watch it. Now, I would have annoyed some of you because, as I said, I've linked this to certain fascistic tendencies. I'm not saying Trump is a fascist. I'm saying there are certain fascistic ideas and mechanisms that are being utilized, and then you've got to start wondering. So Orban's done this. Orban's successfully made Hungary pretty much on the route to being fascistic. He's done almost all of the things we noted earlier. He's closed down the press. He's made all the legal, you know, you know, the lawyers, the judges in Hungary, you know, fit in with his way of thinking. He's used that Christian nationalism. He's us and them to the max. All of the, like, the mythical past, all of that stuff he's done. And then you've got to wonder. So, and again, I'm sorry about this, but I'm linking back to America. You've got to wonder why the GOP, the CPAC, the Conservative Conference, last conference was in Budapest, in Hungary, with Orban. Like, you know, you might get all entrenched in what I'm saying, but you've got to notice what is going on here. Yeah, if we're serious about fascism, if we're serious about, like, Hungary being one of the biggest supporters of the neo-fascist, you know, birds of a feather flock together, another neo-fascist country and leader in Putin, and this authoritarian leader in Viktor Orban, and they're like, and we're slagging off Orban for doing this, and you've come onto like a video stream like this because I'm kind of broadly I am pro-Ukrainian, then there's going to be some cognitive dissonance going on, because actually Orban is not pro-Ukrainian, he is pro-Putin, and the CPAC appears to be pro-Orban. And some of those CPAC members were calling for defunding or no blank check for Ukraine. And so there are some issues here, and there are some similarities between certain ways of thinking in America and in Britain and in every country in the world. I could talk about Marine Le Pen in France. I could talk about the guy in Holland, I forget his name, blonde hair and all that, like wavy blonde hair. You'll correct me, and so on and so forth. These people exist in all the countries that will be using these fascistic ideologies, but also mechanisms to try and further their agenda. And we just need to be wary of that. You know, question. Great physicist Richard Feynman said, "Question yourself." You know, you're the easiest person to fool. So, you know, be wary. I'm paraphrasing. We are the easiest people to fool. We can fool ourselves really easily. Be open to a viewpoint that is alternate to yours, and rather than attack the messenger, in this case me, think about whether anything I've said, you know, has purchase at all. You know, is there any merit in anything I've said? Have you seen elements of fascistic thinking and mechanisms in the world around you, in whatever country you are from? Does your government do some of those? Because I can tell you, my government certainly does, and I'm not afraid to say so. And you know, where are your governments and your favourite politicians on that spectrum? Are you someone who is happily a little bit fascistic? In which case, you know, why is that? What is it about that vision that speaks to you? Just, yeah. But if you're going to disagree with me, please do it respectfully. Let's have a nice discussion about that and about these ideas in the threads below. I do predict some of you attacking me quite strongly. Hey, I've got thick skin. But anyway, thanks so much for hanging out. If you're still here, like, hats off to you, because this is a long one. Please like, subscribe, share, all those ways of supporting. Really appreciate that. And even if you vehemently disagree with me, I'd appreciate if you stuck by me for future videos, and maybe just ignore this one. But I'd like it even more if you had a conversation with yourself. And then if you're going to disagree with me, substantiate that below, because I've written heaps on this. This video could have been like 6 hours long. Right, I've got an awful lot to say about this, and I would happily substantiate a lot more of what I have said in terms of the conclusions I give you. And I always ask for substantiation, and sometimes I don't have enough time to substantiate my own claims, but I can do, so let's go for it if you want. Anyway, toodle pips, laters.